come and open the event officially. His name is Mr. Frank Anwari. He will come and address you and give you the landmark objectives of this day in question before we go to the penalties. Thank you so much, Mr. Frank.
Maybe I may be possible without this microphone. You guys hear me? Okay, or do you hear me better this one?
Yes.
Okay, great. Let me also take this opportunity to say good afternoon, all of you. Our distinguished guests, compatriots who are here, fellow advocates for human rights, members of Rwanda National Congress, and the RNC Foundation. My name indeed, as you have heard, Frank Anwari, the president of the RNC Foundation and the chairman of Rwanda National Congress that David was talking about. So we are so pleased to have all of you here. Really honored on this particular day of human rights. So we are going to be, mine is to welcome you, to make you feel at home, but we are going to have experts who are going to actually dive deeper, who are going to be diving deep into this topic so that you can understand what is it that entails when we talk about human rights. But certainly, I will want to highlight on my side that what do we mean when we are talking about human rights? You know, most of the times, we are so privileged to find ourselves in South Africa, whereby actually we are allowed to have such a time where we can be able to share our unity together, whereby all of us, you can be able to claim those inherent rights. Because we normally take it for granted that you have the right of speech, you have a right to choose, you have a right to associate. We can be able to tell you that this afternoon we're going to single out one country called Rwanda. Not necessarily that that's where I come from, that's why, but simply because it's one country that violates, I think, this shared thing that we're going to talk about today, human rights, more than any other country on the continent. And this I'm going to dive with you into details to show you that what I'm trying to tell you here is not about hearsay. It's something that is backed by evidence. So that you can be able to understand in the right context when you talk about human rights, you may not understand fully until you are denied those same rights you take for granted. I know South Africans, you believe that, no, really, when we talk about human rights, you refer to Sharpeville massacre. That in itself must tell us something, that these human rights you may take for granted, they came at a heavy price. I know most of you look young, though we have some experienced people here who may even have been there then. They will tell you that attaining human rights is not a job. Because when you see, first of all, that you cannot be able to have a job, politicians, because of political position. But these are things that we cannot claim in our countries simply because that right is not there. In that country, Rwanda, you have no right of expression. This is a country which does not have a free press. This is a country where you cannot find free and fair elections. So what happens then? We see the influence that all those countries which are surrounding Rwanda have been destabilized by that same country. I think most of South Africans have come to learn recently that when the president of Rwanda was telling after Rwandan Defense Forces killed South African forces, in Congo, Goma, when the president of Rwanda blatantly mocked the president of South Africa, telling him, if you want a war, just bring it on. But that is when the South Africans were trying to bring peace in the eastern part of Congo, where Rwanda had deployed and still deploys today its forces. One may be asking that, Frank, how does that tie in within the human rights we're talking about today? Now, it gives us everything when we understand that where there is war, there is suffering. And where there is suffering, we just mean that people are not having their rights. Now, when you deploy your forces in a country, in a sovereign country, you don't do it peacefully, you do it forcefully. And when you are doing it forcefully, you are displacing the people who are in that place. And when you are displacing those people, where is the right to education? Where is the right to health? Where is the right actually to speak for yourself when you have an occupying force in your country? And you know what happens? The Congolese begin to run, coming to South Africa, going to neighboring countries. The Rwandans begin to run. The Ugandans begin to run. Why? Because that whole region has been destabilized by one small country. And then when these people get to South Africa, we have also challenges in South Africa where we find that we have issues of unemployment at levels that we do not have to discuss today. And when those scarce resources are being shared by people who do not have a stable or a platform by the government to provide, what do you have? You have chaos. And where are those human rights that we're talking about? So all we are trying to say today, we are having a challenge on African continent caused by politicians who believe that they must use their people to enrich themselves. Because the objective is not to make sure that people are promoted, people have the rights. Instead, they cause chaos so that they can keep plundering. Because one would wonder, why would Rwanda be in Congo? For one sole reason, to plunder the resources of that country. But when they are plundering those resources, who is the beneficiary? Because we are talking about the silence of the international community here. Why do we see that the international community is silencing such kind of chaos? Simply because they are also beneficiaries. Those minerals that are stolen from Congo, who do they benefit? Because Rwanda doesn't consume those minerals, but it sells them to people who consume them for exchange of resources, money, which go to the pockets of those politicians. But if the people, because these rights are about the people, and who are the owners, custodians of power? We the people. But when we give the politicians the powers, and they use those powers against us, not to enrich us, not to promote our rights, what happens? We become the victims of our own selves. Now, when we come to the Human Rights Day, we need to deeply examine ourselves and say, what role do we have in making ourselves victims? Because the more you surrender your right to somebody who is going to use it against you, you cannot be innocent. You are a conspirator in the same program. Because you did not use your voice to actually attain that right that belongs to you. David was saying that I don't know if those rights are given or are inherent. No. You see, human rights, this is something that is for everybody, everywhere. The right to life belongs to all of us. The right to have a choice belongs to everybody. The right to education belongs to everybody. But when the systems have been violated, that's why you begin to find that here, you will hear people normalizing an issue where they say, these foreigners must not access education. Now, you must examine and ask yourself, when you're saying foreigners, have you taken away the humanity? But should we blame those who say they have taken those rights from them? No. Why? Because if you're suffering, you do not look at somebody else. You begin to look at yourself. Now, if you find that South Africa are not receiving the health care that they deserve, the education that they need, and the politicians said, no, but there are people who are doing that. Now, the people are justified. They are saying, but we are not receiving this. Somebody else might be being enriched at my expense. But again, this must go to the deeper understanding of your own right. But when you understand deeply that my rights are not that because somebody else has a right. You can have your rights, I have my rights, and by promoting your right and mine, I promote yours and mine, actually we progress. But you know what our governments are doing? They celebrate development in terms of buildings, and they always fight dissent. Why is there dissent? Simply because people are saying, no, but what you're doing is not to our benefit. But the government want to show us infrastructure which do not transform or translate the so-called development in your pocket. What is it going to do with you if you are looking at the African Mall when at home you're sleeping with an empty stomach? How does it assist you? People have talked about the dollar rising. Now if the dollar is rising, you don't see any difference in you buying something from Pick and Pay. And then when the dollar is down, you do not see the difference. Why should you even bother that the dollar is falling? So what I'm trying to say here is, we need to be very practical as leaders of society. We need to be very practical as leaders of community and say, what are the fundamental rights that we're talking about here and how should they be protected? And if you ask yourself that question, you will understand that no one is going to do it for you without you being involved. That's why we come here and highlight these rights and say, we need a right to democracy. Now, what does democracy mean if there is no free election? What does it make, even does it make sense to you? Why should we talk about constitutionalism if the law does not protect you? So that's why we are talking about this Human Rights Day today, so that we fundamentally understand those rights that affect us. Now, when we tell you, understand the plight of refugees you find in your country, because we are so grateful to South Africa. We are here able to talk about these rights which you cannot do back in our countries. But unless that platform is afforded to us here in South Africa, but for what purpose? Is that we must be able to, because we do not understand these kind of rights. That's why people are going to use us and become the victims of our own selves. And why are we talking about these rights today once again? We are talking about these rights so that we can understand that. Without understanding yourself, you understanding, they say that before you change anything in your life, you must change your mindset. When you change your mindset, you can never point a finger to anybody, because now you understand that you are not a victim, but you can be able to create the future you want. We understand. So that's why when you understand that my right to freedom of anything begins with me, and I must not surrender my rights and tomorrow point a finger. So that's why young people today, you must never be lied to that because you do not have certain education that stops you from thinking. That's not true. Or because you do not have a degree, that's why you are poor. These lights you see, they were never invented by anybody who was a graduate. Are you aware of that? The automobiles you see here outside, Henry Ford was never a graduate. Tom Edison, who did these lights, was never a graduate. But the question is, how are you doing self-development to understand your own and to have an understanding that may be able to project you in the future? How many times do you sit with yourself and define that this is where I want to go, before allowing someone, the follower, to follow the followers? You see, the problem we have, people come and tell us what they have been told. I mean, that is hearsay. We just follow people who are following others without knowing why we are following them. And that you cannot have a future. We need to have a blueprint. and say, what is it that I want in my life? That is what we call self-development. Begin to believe that this is where I'm going. Anyone who do not share with you the objective where you're going, let them off-ramp and move with your agenda. Because at the end of the day, you are self-sufficient. Look at the way you need to be able to collaborate rather than compete with each other. Because competition simply means you are believing that there is not enough. You see, when you come from a position of believing there is not enough, it simply means that we are going to fight for what we do not understand. Because each and every one of you has, or you do have your own share. But now when you believe that Frank is going to take your share, that's not true. It's simply because you're not aware of what you're having. Who is causing the problem? If that chap had not chased me away, I wouldn't be coming to hide here. So now if you want to assist me to live quickly, find out how we can be able to work out a solution to deal with the problem that is making us come here. So without taking much of your time, I will thank you and wish our discussant a great discussion. Thank you so much.